the Gentiles, I think it's 14, the dispute of whether or not the Gentiles need to be circumcised in order to become Christians. In other words, since Judaism came first and then Christianity came second, do you have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian? That was the question. And it makes sense if you're a first century Jew. That's why I said you kind of have to think like a first century Jew. Do you have to become a Jew in order to become a Christian? Do you have to be circumcised and go through the rites of becoming a convert to Judaism before you can become a Christian? And that was really what the Council of Jerusalem stated. And Paul was there with Barnabas, and they talked about how the Holy Spirit had come upon the Gentiles, uncircumcised, okay, non-Jews. And Gentile, in the first century Jewish mind, there are two types of people. There were Jews who were circumcised and followed Moses, and there was everybody else, and they lumped them all as Gentiles, right? And so that was the big question going on at that time. And it was James who finally stood up, got everybody silent, and said, hey, our fathers couldn't keep the law. Why should we make the Gentiles keep the law? Let's write a letter saying, hey, you do not need to be circumcised. You will do well to follow these things, right? Avoid sexual immorality, do not worship idols, and do not eat meat with the blood still in it. And that one still I struggle with. I don't know what the deal is on that, other than probably within the sacrificial system of the pagan world out there, they kept the meat in the blood, and that was something that was probably going on. And so James was the one that made that statement. About somewhere between 63 and maybe 65, 64 AD, James was brought up by the rabbis to the temple. And they brought him up to what's called the parapet of the temple, or a high point on the temple. And all the people were gathered around, and they asked him to denounce that Jesus was the Christ. Okay, now let me explain that just a little bit. The Jews had been looking for their Messiah, which is what they would, or the Mashiach, if you would say it in Hebrew. In Greek, they would call it the Christos, or the Christ, okay? It's a title. It's not his last name, and I think most of you in this room and those watching live understand that, right? That it's Jesus and his title is Christ. It literally means the anointed one. That Jesus was the anointed one, the one whom God would come upon. And they were looking for this person, but they didn't think it was this Jesus, this one who they hung on a tree. And so about 64 AD, they grabbed James, who was the pastor of the Church of Jerusalem, and drug him up to the parapet of the temple. Well, the crowds were gathered around outside and asked him to denounce that Jesus was the Christ. And he refused to do so. And a matter of fact, he started to preach that Jesus is the Christ. He is the anointed one. He is the one that should, and the one and only who should be titled with this. So they took him and they threw him off the parapet. And he went splat on the ground. That didn't kill him. He couldn't get up. His body was broken. And he was there, and from his lying position, wounded and broken, laying on the ground, he continued to preach the gospel until somebody came and took a fuller's club and dashed out his brains. Okay, I know that's graphic, but that's the way Eusebius records his death, and that's the way that, if you have a copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs, that's the way he records his death, which he got his account from Eusebius. And so the Church of Jerusalem, the Jewish church, okay, the Jewish church just lost its pastor. One of the reasons for the writing of the book of Hebrews. And in just a few short years, depending on when we place the timing of the book, either 62 is the early date, maybe as late as 66, the late date, AD. In just 4 short years after that late date, the temple is going to be destroyed by Titus, as he gathers his troops around Jerusalem, a Roman ruler, or Roman, come on, Tony, your brain's not working right. What do you call the guys who have 1,000? I can't think of it right now. Centurion, a Roman centurion. He brings his army around Jerusalem, surrounds Jerusalem. The nobility and the more wealthy people retreat into the Temple Mount area, and they're trying to wait out the Romans. Well, the Romans get impatient, and just a foot soldier decides to just draw a flaming arrow and shoot it at random. It lands on the roof of the temple, which is clad with gold, but underneath that gold, that thin sheet of gold is cedar. You drop a flaming arrow on cedar, and guess what happens? And the temple is burned. The gold melts down into the temple stones, and after the people are burned out and killed in 70 AD, the Romans rush in, and they start scraping the gold off the rocks, and then they start turning over every stone and gathering up the gold that went in between the cracks of the stones, just as Jesus had prophesied when he was on his way to the cross. He said, not one of these stones will be left upon another. And so the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, and the whole Jewish system, sacrificial system, is going to come to a screeching halt. The reasons why, I believe those are the two reasons why this letter was written. And so now let's think about what it would be like to be a Jew in Jerusalem in 63, 64, 65 AD. You would still go to the temple. You may or may not be sacrificing animals. Okay? For us, that sounds awfully weird. But for them, they were Jews. This is what they did. Even though they believed that Jesus was the Christ, the ultimate sacrifice, many of them had not given up the going to temple and sacrificing. And many of the Jews, even James himself, did not think that this was odd or wrong. Now let's go back to what happened